99% of this planet's population is unconscious right now. Not for a night, not for a season, for 11 months at a time, sealed in enormous cryogenic vaults, some holding more than 12,000 people. The other 1% didn't choose to stay awake. They were assigned to it an entire population of custodians and technomagi, living inside a single lit dome 50 kilometers from the vaults, keeping a civilization alive while it sleeps. This isn't a ritual. It isn't a religious observance. It's the only way this planet's population has found to survive its own orbit. And somewhere inside that system, inside a structure built to keep an entire civilization alive through unconsciousness, a heretic is about to prove exactly how fragile it really is. Every part of Hubris's civilization exists because of one number, 29. That's how many standard months make up a single solar cycle here, the result of an unusually elliptical orbit around its sun. Of those 29 months, 11 are spent locked in cold severe enough to be lethal to an unprotected population. A stable, temperate world doesn't need a sun dome. It doesn't need mass cryogenic stasis. It doesn't need a 1% population of custodians running an entire planet alone. Every institution on Hubris, the vaults, the dome, the regency, the Arbite's presence, the class-divided tombs, exists downstream of that single orbital fact. Which raises the obvious question. Why would anyone settle a world like this at all? The colonists who founded Hubris didn't know what they were arriving at. They crossed roughly 70 years of void aboard a cryogenic sleeper ship, sealed in the same kind of stasis that would later define their descendants' lives. And they arrived expecting a world they could settle. What they found instead was this orbit. By the time they understood what they'd actually arrived at, turning back meant another multi-decade crossing with no promise of anything better on the other end. 70 years already spent. So they made the only decision that let those 70 years mean something. They stayed and committed to making an unlivable world work. History gave that decision a name, not a neutral one, a judgment. Hubris. Committing to stay didn't solve the problem of how. 11 months of lethal cold isn't survivable through architecture alone. It requires taking the population out of the equation entirely for most of the year. The colonists already possessed the technology to do that. Their cryogenic chambers had kept them alive for 70 years in transit. Rather than let that hardware sit idle after landing, they stripped it out of the ship and installed it on the surface, repurposing a system built for a single 70-year voyage into permanent, indefinite infrastructure. That single decision is the load-bearing fact of this entire civilization. Hubris didn't design a survival system from scratch. It cannibalized an escape vessel and turned it into a way of life. The result is a three-phase cycle, 11 months of dormant, when 99% of the population freezes in stasis. Then, thaw, a deliberate recovery window built around feasting, because a body doesn't return from months of cryosleep instantly. Then, vital, the stretch when Hubris briefly functions like any other Imperial world. And that's what creates the strangest feature of this civilization. For most of its existence, it isn't actually awake. Someone still has to keep the machinery running through all 11 frozen months, monitoring the vaults, maintaining the systems, preparing for reawakening, while conscious through an entire planetary ice age. That's not a maintenance detail. That's the second civilization Hubris had to build on top of the first. The 1% that remains conscious isn't a skeleton crew rotating through shifts. It's a permanent, organized population custodian and technomagi with their own dedicated settlement, the Sun Dome. Population 59,000. Lit by a plasma ball engineered to simulate daylight, 50 kilometers from the vault fields. For 11 months of every 29, it is the only functioning settlement on the entire planet. Here's the detail that turns the dome from an engineering solution into something closer to a diagnosis. Its artificial light is calibrated brighter than it needs to be, not marginally noticeably. The retinue's savant, Uber offers an explanation for this during the investigation. The excess brightness is likely intentional, designed to counteract the psychological toll of the perpetual night surrounding the dome on every side. That single design choice tells you something the vault statistics don't. It suggests Hubris's survival planners weren't only solving for body temperature, they may have also been solving for what 11 months of enclosure and encircling darkness does to a mind that has to remain conscious and functional through all of it. The overbright dome wasn't simply decoration. Amos suspected it was a countermeasure against the psychological toll of 11 months of darkness. And the dome isn't a sterile installation. Either it's a town with commerce, a social hierarchy, and a vice economy running underneath it, including a joy house where a woman working under an assumed name has spent the last 4 years. Her real name is Elizabeth Bequin. She matters later. If you assume that mass cryogenic stasis flattens a society, that everyone becomes equal once they're all unconscious, the vault structure says otherwise. The vaults aren't a single undifferentiated mass of sleepers. They're organized by class. One vault in particular, Processional 212, sits on the west end of the planet's Great Imperial Avenue and holds 12,142 people, specifically members of Hubris's ruling elite, sealed apart from the general population. Even unconscious, this civilization maintains its stratification. The elite don't sleep among everyone else. They sleep in their own tomb. That detail matters for a reason that isn't obvious yet, but hold on to the number. 12,142 isn't just a population count. It's about to become a target. Governing all of this, at least nominally, is a regency system under a high custodian named Carpel, with law enforcement handled by the Adeptus Arbites, represented locally by a chastener named Godwin Fischig. Neither of them yet knows how directly their planet is about to be tested. Step back and look at what Hubris's survival system actually requires to function. A population that is, for 11 months a year, almost entirely unconscious, undefended, and dependent on a small awake minority to keep the machinery running correctly. That is not a resilient arrangement. It's a system with a single point of failure, repeated across every vault on the planet's sleepers, who cannot resist, cannot flee, and cannot even be aware that anything has gone wrong until they're already dead. Anyone who understood that structure and who wanted to commit an act of violence with almost no resistance would find no better target in the Imperium than an ice world's dormant season. In the Imperial year 240 M41, someone did understand it. Inquisitor Gregor Eisenhorn lands on Hubris, hunting Murden Iclone, a heretic he has pursued for 6 years. But Iclone isn't hiding from Eisenhorn on Hubris. He's already been here, and he arrived with a plan. 2 facts establish that this wasn't opportunistic. Iclone reached Hubris well before Eisenhorn did, and the sabotage he carries out on the cryonic vault system is not spontaneous. It's premeditated, engineered in advance, targeting a system Iclone clearly understood in the same structural terms laid out above a population that cannot resist. His operation reaches Processional 212, the vault containing 12,142 members of Hubris's ruling elite, sealed in a system built specifically to make them defenseless while unconscious. Thousands died as Iclone sabotaged the cryonic system, while the larger ritual he'd prepared was abandoned before it could be completed. The purpose behind it isn't random cruelty. It's tied to a plan to empower an arch-heretic named Pontius Glaw, working toward his eventual return to a physical body. Why the elite vault specifically, rather than any other, is a question the surviving record doesn't fully answer. Whether their status was ritually significant, or whether Iclone simply targeted the largest concentrated population he could reach, isn't confirmed. That detail sits with Iclone's broader conspiracy, off Hubris, beyond what this investigation can establish here. What's confirmed is the cost. Eisenhorn's own aide, Loris Vivin, dies in the resulting chaos, a loss that hardens the Inquisitor for what's coming next. In the aftermath, Hubris's regency government arrests Eisenhorn, not Iclone. Their logic: an Inquisitor arrived, and mass death followed, so the Inquisitor must be responsible. Eisenhorn clears himself with the same structural logic already established here. Iclone arrived before him, and the sabotage was planned well in advance of Eisenhorn's landing. Sequence alone disproves the accusation, but that same fact does something more important than clear his name. It confirms that Iclone didn't come to Hubris to hide from Eisenhorn. He came because Hubris itself, its orbit, its dormant cycle, its unconscious elite, was the objective. The manhunt Eisenhorn thought he was running turns out to be a much smaller thread inside something considerably larger. 2 additions join Eisenhorn out of this chaos: Fiskik, the local chastener, is forced into the investigation as the Regency's condition for releasing Eisenhorn, a local authority, now permanently, inside an Imperial-level case. The second is unplanned. During a raid on the Joy House, Elizabeth Bequin kills an attacker, closing in on Eisenhorn, saving his life. What matters isn't the act, it's what Eisenhorn, a psyker, immediately recognizes in her. She's a blank, someone whose presence can disrupt or nullify psychic phenomena, and who can operate around psychers and psychic phenomena with an unusual degree of resistance. Her discovery is accidental in circumstance, but strategically important once Eisenhorn understands what she is. Another piece of evidence. In a case that keeps producing more questions than it answers, iClone's sabotage leaves behind a physical clue, a strange casket connected to the cryogenic machinery, its purpose incomplete without a missing component. The local technomagi don't recognize it as anything belonging to Hubris. That's the first indication that iClone's operation involved technology and a purpose that came from outside the planet's normal systems. That's not a loose end. A device this deliberately engineered, built to sabotage a mass stasis system, and left deliberately incomplete, is the first concrete link between what happened on Hubris and whatever iClone was actually working toward. The casket is incomplete, which means the plan is incomplete, and an incomplete heretical plan means Eisenhorn isn't closing this case. He's opening a much larger one. For Eisenhorn, the trail into all of that begins with this object. It eventually leads off Hubris toward Houseclaw, an alien species called the Saruthi, and a forbidden chaos text known as the Necrotuke. None of that happens on this planet, but this is where the trail begins. Strip away the manhunt, and Hubris tells you something uncomfortable about the Imperium it belongs to. This is a world where an entire civilization's survival depends on trusting a tiny fraction of its population to protect everyone else, while they're rendered completely defenseless for 11 months of every 29, generation after generation. That arrangement isn't a flaw the Imperium is trying to fix. It's simply how this world has learned to exist, because the alternative was abandoning the planet altogether. iClone didn't need to storm a fortress or break a shield wall to kill 12,000 people. He needed to understand a cycle the Imperium already tolerates as normal, and exploit the one structural weakness built into it by design: unconsciousness. Hubris survived by teaching its people to surrender consciousness to the system, generation after generation, and trust that the system would give it back. iClone's contribution to that arrangement was recognizing the one thing its designers never had to plan for: that the same surrender which kept this population alive also made it, for 11 months at a time, completely unable to defend itself. That is the discovery Eisenhorn actually leaves Hubris with, not a solved case, but a working model of how the Imperium's own survival architecture can be turned into a weapon against it. The casket in his hands is incomplete. The conspiracy behind it isn't. And whatever finished what iClone started is still waiting, off this ice world, for him to find it.